Welcome back to Unsolved Mysteries, JonBenét's WebbTruths. Please like, share, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for updates. On our last episode, we discussed the plethora of tangible clues left around the crime scene. On tonight's episode, I was planning on speaking about eyewitness accounts relating to this crime when I remembered something District Attorney Alex Hunter once said. He said,
"This is a difficult case. This is a circumstantial evidence case. Those cases take longer. They require more patience. And I hope that for your viewers and for your readers, you will talk about the difference between some kind of eyewitness case and the kind of case that we have dealing with the death of this sweet, innocent, beautiful child."
So apparently Mr. Hunter believes this is a circumstantial evidence case, not an eyewitness case, and suggests that we talk about the difference, and so we shall. But let's see what former Detective Steve Thomas had to say on Larry King Live in 2000. He said,
"Everybody at this table wishes it was a smoking gun, no doubt, beyond a reasonable doubt case. It's not. It's a circumstantial case."
Yeah. Well, all cases where there's no witness.
Well, not necessarily if there's ballistics or DNA evidence or a bloody fingerprint.
wow, that's a deer in the headlights look if I ever saw one. It's almost as if he just remembered there is DNA evidence, but he also believes this is a circumstantial evidence case and not an eyewitness case. So let's see why. Because in the Ramsey's book, The Death of Innocence, they write, "We discovered other deficiencies that surfaced in the official investigation of our neighborhood around 755 15th Street. All of the neighbors living close to our former house had not been interviewed after the murder. In effect, some of the people in the closest concentric circle to where the murder occurred were simply written off as possible sources of information. We understood that one of the Boulder detectives had justified this omission by telling Officer Steve Ainsworth, who is on special assignment to the DA's office, 'We don't need to do that. We know what happened. The Ramseys did it.'" Well, that might explain why DA Alex Hunter and Detective Steve Thomas are apparently not aware of any eyewitness testimonies. But a few pages later, the Ramseys elaborate. They say, "On December 6, 1997, an article in the New York Times brought an issue to light on the national scale that should have started to unravel the police mask of competence. A University of Colorado history professor, Patricia Limerick, who lived directly across the street from our house at 755 15th Street, was interviewed. In this particular story, Patricia said, 'My husband and I have never interviewed by the police. For weeks I assumed it was a measure of how well the police were doing. Now I am not so sure. 11 months have passed since the murder, and the neighborhood around our former house had never been completely canvassed. Where were the police?' Patricia Limerick was asking the right questions. Well, right about now I'm questioning DA Hunter and Detective Thomas's declarations that this is a circumstantial and not eyewitness case. Because on tonight's episode of JonBenét's WebbTruths, we will present a plethora of eyewitness account testimonies, starting with one that comes from the interrogation of John Ramsey by the late great Detective Lou Smith, in which Lou asks, 'Do you know anyone that owns a black Jaguar?' John asks, 'Late model like XJS or a later model?' Lou says, 'Right.' John says, 'No, they had a white one, the whites. It was kind of an unusual color, gold, it wasn't green, you know, but I don't remember.' Lou asks, 'Did they have a Jaguar convertible?' John says, 'They do, yeah.' Lou says, 'Do you know anyone that owns a..." John interrupts, "Hold on, yes I do. There is a guy that had an apartment or apartments in Barbara Fernie's mother's complex that we looked at renting. This was after this happened, for a place to live, and he had a black Jaguar, I believe.' Lou informs us there was one seen in the neighborhood of the whites on that morning or that evening, so..." And John replies, "That's the only black Jaguar I've seen in Boulder. This guy's got to be a short guy. He was in real estate. He was in..." But just peculiar, wasn't? I mean, no, but the Fernies might, because I think they put... I can't think of the name of the apartment complex, but it's where Barbara's mother had an apartment in Boulder. He had to leave, I think. He had left it there, where he had a sublease, perhaps." Which is further documented in a January 2002 deposition of Detective Lou Smith, in which he says on the 25th there was a Christmas party at the Whites, just before the murder, just before the Ramseys came home, and there was a suspicious Jaguar vehicle, reported in police reports, driving back and forth by the Whites' residence on numerous occasions. I assume he is speaking of BPD report number 26-125, which states on Christmas Day 1996, someone inside a Ramsey family's friend's home noticed that a Jaguar convertible drove by that home at least 5 times. The Ramseys joined close friends for dinner inside that home on Christmas Day night. Now we have a bolo, or be on the lookout for, a black Jaguar convertible, XJS or later model, as I believe it was likely involved in the crime and used as a lookout vehicle, because there was one seen near the Whites that evening, which is pretty significant, as where they live in this dead-end neighborhood, there should not be too many vehicles driving by there too often, as just about every other intersection on this map would be more justifiably traveled intersection, as they are more part of the grid. Continuing on with Detective Lou Smith's interrogation of John Ramsey, Lou tells us about a van that was seen in the neighborhood that evening. He says, "How about anybody that owns an Astro-Type van? Do you have any friends that own that, or people from Access that?" There was an Astro-Type van seen in the area in the report. John asks what color. Lou says there was no color. John says the Access had a van that was a white Chrysler minivan. Astro van? No, I don't. Lou says, is it possible to tell? John says, except it might be a gray Caravan 5th Avenue, the one going down the street in 102, which could have been Fleet's. He had a gray Caravan. Then Lou moves on. So we are now also on the lookout for an Astro-Type van of unidentified color, according to this June of 1998 transcript. However, looking further into this mystery mobile, we learn more from an interesting source. Because around 1 year ago on the JonBenet Reddit page, 2 amateur detectives, one named M. May 333 and Samar Candy, are discussing the sightings of a mysterious Astro-Type van, and Samar Candy provides an excerpt of a deposition of Detective Lou Smith, where he says, "On the 24th, just the day before the murder, there was a very suspicious party parked in a blue van directly across the street from the Ramseys' residence. This was in a police report and included in the police file. It was reported by a neighbor." M. May 333 posts BPD report number 1-98, which states, "On December 24th, 1996, in the morning hours, a neighbor who was also a personal friend of Boulder Detective Linda Arndt observed a dark blue Astro van parked across the street from the Ramsey home. On December 25th, at 10 a.m., the same neighbor observed a dark blue Astro van traveling northbound on 15th Street in the 700 block and stopped in front of the Ramsey home. On December 26, 1996, the same neighbor may have seen a dark blue Astro van parked in the same general location near front of Ramsey home." To which Samar Candy says, "Ooh, thanks, May. I didn't have these details. I've never gotten around to collecting all this stuff from Woodward's book, which I suppose these were in. You obviously have, so thanks for doing the work. This is what I had in my notes about the van. Gene Fortier reported a dark blue Astro van parked across from 755 15th Street on both Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. As far as is known, no one knows whose vehicle it was or who they may have been visiting or watching." So now we know it is reported to have been a dark blue Astro van, and it was eyewitnessed by a woman named Gene Fortier, who is a neighbor from up the road, whose children had met the Ramsey children for the first time and were at the Ramsey's house playing on that infamous Christmas Day. But to get a better idea of her vantage point, we turn to this map of 15th Street where the Ramsey home was located. And going 2 houses to the south, we find the Fortier house. But while we are on this map, directly across the street is the Limerick house, where the aforementioned Patricia lived, who had never been questioned by the Boulder Police Department. And we will come back to this map more as we move along. But bringing it back to the clues, I introduce you to what is known as the Bonita Papers, which were written by a woman named Bonita Sawyer, who is the secretary / paralegal for a Denver attorney named Dan Hoffman. But once again, I will turn to internet poster Samara Candy to explain it, as she did a wonderful job explaining on the JonBenet Ramsey murder discussion community page. She stated, "The Bonita Papers are purported to be notes on the case, written up by paralegal Bonita Sawyer in 1999. Sawyer worked in the offices of Dan Hoffman, a Denver lawyer who was for a time working pro bono for the Boulder Police in the lead-up to the grand jury investigation as a member of the police dream team, who were advising the police on how to present their case. Many police files would have come into Hoffman's office from August 1997, when he was first appointed. Internet poster Spade, which she details further below, said, Bonita wrote her material up in 1999. It would seem likely that this would have been after the grand jury disbanded in October 1999. When the notes appeared on the Forums for Justice forums in 2004, The story that circulated along with them was that Sawyer thought she might one day write a book about the case, and so she kept her own notes from all the documents she had been given access to during her time in the Hoffman offices. The story also goes that the notes she had written up came to be stolen by a nephew of hers, and from him, somehow a poster by the name of Spade got hold of them. It was through Spade that they ended up on Forums for Justice. Because of their source and the anonymity of the poster Spade, many people do not trust the Bonita papers as being what they were purported to be by him. That is a choice each person has to make for his or herself. As for myself, I find them to have a ring of authenticity about them, as they appear to have been written by a well-educated person who likely had legal training. I have read many of Spade's posts and believe him to be honest in what he writes. It is also my understanding that he was at the time a local resident, and therefore could have been an acquaintance of Sawyer's nephew, the one who got a hold of the notes. So I am prepared to believe the notes were an accurate presentation of evidence the police said they had gathered from December 1996 through to September 1998, and that they appeared on the internet in the way Spade described. Which for the most part, I tend to agree with also, at least in the validity of the opening statement, in which she speaks of neighbor Melody Stanton, who heard a child scream that evening. Bonita says, Melody Stanton awoke abruptly from a deep sleep. The prior stillness of the Boulder night had been pierced by the harrowing scream of a child. She assumed it was somewhere between midnight and 2 a.m., but didn't look at the alarm clock. The scream lasted 3 to 5 seconds and stopped as abruptly as it started. Melody momentarily wondered what to do, but thought that surely the parents would hear and come to the child's rescue. Although still bothered by the scream and the thought that a child had been injured, Melody eventually went back to sleep. Melody Stanton was interviewed by Detective Barry Hartkopp on January 3rd. Stanton lives across the street in one house to the south of the Ramseys. Her bedroom is on the second floor of the west side of the house, which faces the Ramsey home. On Christmas night, she had gone to bed at approximately 10 p.m. Stanton always slept with her window slightly open, and on that night she had it opened 6 to 8 inches. She related that she had fallen asleep shortly after she went to bed, but was awakened by one loud, incredible scream. She related it was obviously from a child, and that it lasted 3 to 5 seconds and then abruptly stopped. It appeared that the sound came from across the street south of the Ramsey residence. She did not look at the clock, but estimated the time at somewhere between 12 a.m. and 2 a.m. She stayed awake and listened for any other noise for 5 to 10 minutes, but heard absolutely nothing. After that, no cars, no voices, no footsteps, so she eventually went back to sleep. Stanton said she had not left on any televisions or radios when she went to bed. She admitted she did not sit up in bed to look out the window, so she did not see any activity outside her window. When asked why she had not come forward this information right after the homicide when detectives had canvassed the neighborhood, Stanton said she was shocked by JonBenét's death, that she at first did not make any connection to the scream. Also, since none of the other neighbors had not mentioned to her about hearing a scream, she began to doubt she actually heard it. In fact, when she told her husband, he said she had probably imagined it. It was Diane Brumfitt, a friend of Stanton's, who reported this incident to the Boulder police after her conversation with Stanton. So neighbor Melody Stanton appears to have heard a scream just after midnight on Boxing Day, which is not surprising, as on the front of the home facing the road is a window and pipe in the boiler room, which explains how she was able to so easily hear JonBenet scream. And I had every intention of using a clip of private investigator John St. Augustine on the Dr. Oz show, explaining to Dr. Oz how this could be. But unfortunately, the fine folks on YouTube or the Dr. Oz show do not fully understand the concept of commentary under the Fair Use Act and gave me my first copyright strike. So, we will go about this a totally different way, and I will transform it into my own masterpiece by speaking over the video while trying to explain that the belief is that JonBenet was somewhere in this boiler room / hallway area, and the sound of her scream was radiator amplified through this pipe on the east side of the home, which sent the sound directly towards Melody Stanton's home and slightly opened window. Which makes perfectly good sense to me, as we see from our aerial map of 15th Street in the Ramsey home, that directly across the street, just south of the Limerick house, is the Stanton home. However, in Detective Steve Thomas's book, he tells the Melody Stanton story a bit differently. He states, "But we all agreed that Melody Stanton, the neighbor who claimed to have heard a scream, obviously that of a child on Christmas night, could have done so. I wanted to go over and talk to her then and dig deeper into her story, but Deputy D.A. DeMuth refused putting a blockade between police and Melody Stanton. He said he planned to prep her before trial. DeMuth didn't explain his reasons to mere police officers and detectives. I could not fathom why a prosecutor would intentionally stop us from talking to her. Such a thing had never happened before in any investigation I was involved in, but with a wave of his hand, poof, DeMuth sealed off an important avenue investigation from the investigators. I knew that in other cities, not only would the prosecutor have okayed the interview, but he probably would have helped conduct it on the spot. The difference of opinion between the DA's office and the police had thrown into question whether or not there was a scream at all. It would be up to a jury to make the ultimate decision. So at this point in his book, he is saying that Deputy District Attorney Tripp DeMuth was blocking police from interviewing Melody Stanton. However, elsewhere in his book, he states, in a few days, another neighbor, Melody Stanton, who lived at 738 15th Street, diagonally across from the Ramsey home, also changed her original story, which was that she had not noticed anything unusual on the night JonBenet died. When a detective interviewed her a second time, Stanton admitted that she had not told the truth earlier because she did not want to be involved in the case. She now claimed to have heard the piercing scream of a child between midnight and 2 o'clock on the morning of December 26. If that cry came from JonBenet, it would help determine the time of death. If a neighbor clear across the street heard the scream, I wondered how anyone in the house could not have heard it. Her story, which seemed to be a clear piece of evidence, contained its own seed of destruction, however. More than a year later, we would discover that Stanton also told the detective it may not have been an audible scream, but rather the negative energy radiating from JonBenet. The detective returned to that odd point several times during the interview, but Stanton never again mentioned the negative energy. She insisted that she heard an audible scream, so the detective did not include the negative energy comment in his report. A year later, he was ordered to write an amended report. Changing a report is a huge issue for police since it brings the validity of the entire statement into question. His revised report was not the first, and it would not be the last, that would enter the Ramsey case file. So Mr. Thomas puts the validity of Melody's statement in question once again. However, in 2016, investigative journalist Paula Woodward publishes her book titled We Have Your Daughter, in which she reveals new evidence, which brings the validity of Melody's statement back into question. She states, another Ramsey neighbor stated that she had heard one loud, incredible scream that was the loudest, most terrifying scream she had ever heard. It was obviously from a child and lasted 3 to 5 seconds, at which time it stopped abruptly. She thought the parents would hear the scream. The scream came from across the street south of the Ramsey residence. It happened between midnight and 2 a.m. the morning of December 26, 1996, from BPD reports number 1, 1930, number 1, 174, and number 1, 175. From BPD reports 1, 174, 1, 481, 1, 1548, another neighbor who lived south of the Ramsey house contacted a BPD detective on December 31st because of the scream the first neighbor had heard. The neighbor said she also heard a scream. She was interviewed on February 26, 1997. So now we have 2 confirmed eyewitnesses who heard her scream that evening. But that is not the only significant clue that we will get from the Barn Hills, because according to Perfect Murder, Perfect Town author Lawrence Schiller, there is a bit more to the story, and it involves this man, Jeff Shapiro, who was a reporter for the Globe. But Lawrence Schiller writes, it wasn't long afterward that Shapiro found Melody Stanton, the Ramsey's neighbor who had heard the scream the night JonBenet was killed. Unaware of how important her memory of that night was to police, she told Shapiro what she told the police on December 26. Also buried in this Globe story was the fact that Stanton's husband had heard a crashing sound, the sound of metal on concrete, sometime after the scream. This suggested that someone, possibly an intruder, had left the house. The story, which made headlines, was a scoop for Shapiro. So not only was Melody Stanton abruptly awakened by a child's scream, but after waking up her husband and then going back to sleep, he would hear a crashing sound, which he described as the sound of metal on concrete. While we were on the conversation of neighbors who witnessed unusual activity around the house that evening, we come to BPD report number 1-99, which states, another neighbor who lived just north of the Ramsey house told police investigators that at midnight between December 25th and 26th, he looked out his kitchen window at the Ramsey residence and observed the upper kitchen lights were on and dimmed low. He added that this was the first time that he had seen these particular lights illuminated in the 5 years that he'd lived next door to the Ramseys. He said these lights were located in the ceiling above the kitchen window. Moving over to the book Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, Lawrence Schiller states, at about midnight, Scott Gibbons, a neighbor, looked out his kitchen window toward the Ramsey house and saw a light on in the kitchen area. So now we have a name to go with the original BPD report we just mentioned. But a few pages later, Schiller also informs us that Scott Gibbons, the Ramseys' next-door neighbor, told police that at about 8 a.m. he saw the door on his side of the Ramseys' house open. Schiller also adds, but by then, anyone inside the house could have opened the door. Which may have been true, however, I do not believe anyone approved to be in the house that morning would likely have left the door just hanging open on a cold December morning in the mountains of Colorado. But to get a better understanding of the proximity of Mr. Gibbons' house to the Ramsey house, we go back to our aerial map of 15th Street, which shows that the houses are relatively close to one another. And in case you're questioning how Mr. Gibbons would have been able to see that from his house, courtesy of prominent internet poster Jameson245, this is a picture that was taken with their back against the wall from right below the window he would have been looking out, which not only shows a relatively clear line of sight to the open door, but also the kitchen window above in which he saw the strange lights on, which he had never seen before in the 5 years he had lived next to the Ramseys. And in case you didn't notice how recessed back that window is from the Butler door, I present a video from the Paula Woodward YouTube channel where the cameraman is identifying it as the kitchen window.
Window is located directly over the Butler's kitchen and the north door,
which demonstrates that from that angle it would be difficult to see anything but odd lighting in the ceiling. However, the Ramseys themselves provide us with additional information in one of their books when they state, "I was shocked to see that they had found the Butler kitchen door, which led to the outside, open. This was reported by one of our friends when he arrived shortly after 6 in the morning. I'd never even noticed that open door as we were frantically rushed around making phone calls, and yet there on the police diagram on our home was the note, door found open." So supposedly one of their friends who arrived that morning also reported finding the side Butler pantry door open.
I didn't understand how someone could have gotten in. Of course, I learned later that one of the doors was found wide open.
How do we know for sure? We turn to the deposition of Detective Lou Smith from the 2002 Wolf Ramsey case, in which he states, "It was noted in a police report that John Fernie, one of the friends of John Ramsey and one of the friends that was called over, he arrived at the scene shortly after 6 a.m. The call was made perhaps 10 minutes later. John Fernie immediately got in his car, went to the Ramsey home and arrived there shortly after 6 a.m. When he arrived there, he told his wife that the door to the Butler door was open. This is a photograph, an early photograph that was taken of that Butler door. The person who took this photograph took it for a reason. The door is open." To which he is asked, "And that was taken by a Boulder Police Department crime scene technician?" Lou says yes. And I believe this is that picture. So it appears the door on the northwest corner of the Ramsey home, often referred to as the Butler door, had in fact been left open that morning. And while we have the door open, I believe this is a good opportunity to try to explain how exactly the Butler pantry ties into the rest of the house. Because the floor plan drawings can be kind of confusing, as this house is in a way actually a 5-story or multi-split level home. But we will start with the stairs going to the west, which go directly to the bottom of the infamous spiral staircase, on which the ransom note was found, and leads directly up to just outside of JonBenét's bedroom. Coming back down the spiral staircase to that set of stairs, we observe that there are a total of 8 stairs there before you get to the Butler pantry level. To see how you get from that level to the basement stairs, we will focus in on the few stairs going to the east, which is more easily understood by utilizing another of Paula Woodward's YouTube channel videos, where it shows the Butler pantry door pans to the right and shows 2 stairs going straight up. 1 stair to the right, followed by 1 more stair straight up, and a stair to the left, which leads to the basement door, which is just to the right. So from the spiral staircase, that makes 8 steps down, across the Butler pantry floor, and 5 steps up, before descending down the basement stairs. But there is one other path that could have been taken, which would have been to go down the hall, cut left through the kitchen, and then cut left again, go down 3 steps, and take a right to go down the basement stairs. But now that we have a better understanding of the layout of the house and how the various paths that the intruder could have taken to bring JonBenet into the basement, we will go back outside too. Our next clue regarding neighbors observing odd things that evening comes from BPD report number 1-1196. Which states, "Furthermore, a neighbor who lives immediately south of the Ramsey residence got up to use the restroom and saw that the light in the southeast corner of the house, which had been left on every night for the past 5 years, was out." And once again, we look to Lawrence Schiller's Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, put a name to the BPD report, because Schiller states, "Diane Brumfitt, another neighbor, told Detective Barry Hartkopp on December 31st that on Christmas night, she did not see a light on at the southeast corner of the Ramsey house, though there had been a safety light in that spot for years. She remembered thinking that it was unusual. Now, to determine the proximity of Diane Brumfitt's house to the Ramseys' house, we go back to our aerial map of 15th Street, where we see that their houses were not that far apart. And in case you were in doubt of neighbor Diane Brumfitt's line of sight, once again, courtesy of prominent internet poster and amateur detective Jameson245, this is a picture taken with back against the wall from right below her kitchen window, and this is back against the wall from right below her TV room. But back to the conversation of safety lights, we go back to the interrogation of John Ramsey by Detective Lou Smith. He asks, where was the street light located at? John says, I don't remember. I think there's a telephone pole right in here somewhere. Lou says in front of the... John says, I mean, there was one down here maybe. Yeah, they are in the front of the house. No, that's not right. The telephone pole is in the back of the house. We had a lawn light that was out at the edge of the drive, edge of the sidewalk. Lou asks, was that normally on or off? John says, I think it was normally on. It usually was left on all the time. Lou continues by asking, how about on the first floor? John says, I think we might have left lights on in the study. We might have left the light on, in front of the window here sometimes. Lou asks, solarium? John says, in the solarium. Lou says, we talked to Miss Bloomfield Brumfitt next door. She said normally the light was on in the solarium, but that night it was off. Does that sound logical? John says, well, it's possible. I mean, we came home after dark. We were tired. Burke and I played in the living room for a little bit, but I can't say for certain that I turned it on. Sometimes this light, there is an outdoor light right there. Sometimes that. Lou interjects with the question, door light? You're pointing to the door light of the solarium that opens to the south? John says, right. Sometimes we would leave this light on here, outside of the dining room doors, because it illuminated the patio. Lou asks, to the west? John says, right, but not always. So we at least had some lights on normally. We never turn them all off. I guess I shouldn't say never, but never intentionally turn them all off. I wasn't comfortable. So while on the north side of the home, the butler's kitchen door was left ajar, on the south side of the home, where the infamous window well is located, there's apparently a burnout or turned off light. Speaking of dim lit lights, we find ourselves back with Detective Steve Thomas and his book Inside the Ramsey Murder Investigation for our next eyewitness neighbor account, in which he states, another reason to interview the Barnhills, however, was that Joe had told the police he had seen JonBenét's older half-brother John Andrew in Boulder on the evening of December 25th. Thomas says John Andrew claimed to have been in Atlanta at the time. Come on, Steve, you know damn well he was in Atlanta that night. But Thomas continues, during the interview, Barnhill sheepishly told us he had made a mistake and apologized, saying that he would probably not even recognize the young man in a crowd. Thomas concludes that went a long way toward firming up John Andrews' alibi. So even though it appears Detective Steve Thomas is still questioning John Andrews' alibi, what I gathered from Joe Barnhill's statement is that he actually saw someone who resembled John Andrew Ramsey, which would explain why when District Attorney Alex Hunter answered the way that he had when questioned about John Andrew. That exchange went as follows.
Mr. Hunter, can you tell me if John Andrew Ramsey's alibi is now being questioned?
We have more work to do on John Andrews' alibi.
Well, that answer did not satisfy many people, including the reporters who just a short while later asked the follow-up question.
Alex, if you could respond to the John Ramsey Jr. alibi question. Earlier, very early on, the police indicated that he was out of state, and common sense sort of indicates if a person's out of state, it's fairly difficult to commit a crime. Does that mean you no longer believe that?
I'm just saying that there's more work that we're doing on that.
Clarify that.
No, I don't want to go beyond that.
And although D.A. Hunter does not want to clarify or go beyond that, I say. So now we are on the lookout for a John Andrew doppelganger, or at least someone who resembled him from a distance, but not necessarily a far distance. As we go back to our 15th Street aerial map in the Ramsey home, we see that the Barnhill house is just kitty corner across the street, just north of Patricia Limerick's. But looking further into the story of Joe Barnhill, we look to the internet, more specifically the website at candyrose.com, where they have a message board called Voy Forums and a thread titled Subject Joe Barnhill, in which a poster named Rita Johnson says in November of 2003 that Joe Barnhill and her have spoken on numerous occasions, and he very sadly said he has never been contacted by the family and doesn't know why. She adds, the only one that contacted him was one of their investigators telling him to be quiet and never talk about what he saw the morning of the murder. He said, "They told me I was mistaken. I found that to be very odd."
Well, I find that to be particularly odd also, as
John Ramsey tells things a bit differently while being interrogated by former Assistant U.S. Attorney and Grand Jury Specialist Michael Caine, who was brought into the DA's office by Alex Hunter, who says, "Okay, you have heard, I am sure, that you had a neighbor, I believe, that lived in, is it Melody Stanton, 738? John says, kinda catty corner? Okay, yeah." Caine says, 738 across the street from you, who said that she heard a scream. John says, "Well, I heard that a scream was heard. I assumed it was down here, so this is, and I saw this when we looked at it, but I always thought it was from this house. I don't know why." But Caine continues his questioning. He asks, "Did you know Melanie Stanton?" John says, "We met the woman who lived there. We think had a son or a daughter. I think it was a son, but I don't know her. In fact, I wouldn't recognize her, I don't think." Caine asks, "You haven't talked to her?" John says, "No." Caine asks, "At all?" John says, "No." Caine asks, "So you haven't followed up on that?" John says, "Well, I don't know," and asks his attorney Brian Morgan, "Have we?" Morgan says, "I think we tried to." Caine asks, "Do you have any further information on that?" John says, "No, I don't. I mean, I also heard somebody heard a grate being scraped across the pavement." Caine asks, "Who is that?" John says, "I don't know. I just heard that." Caine says, "What was that?" Ramsey's private investigator David Williams says, "I think that came from the internet. I think it's supposed to be Melanie Stanton's husband. And I think that it was the banging of a grate, and I believe that its basis comes from a tabloid." Caine says, "Okay." Detective Lou Smith asks, "But you haven't contacted the Stantons at all?" Williams says, "I think we tried." Smith says, "So you were unsuccessful?" Attorney Morgan says, "I believe so. We will let you know. She is one of the people that wants to talk with us, I think." Their PI, David Williams, concludes, "But I think the information originally came from the Globe about the scream and the grate, the metal pounding against cement, something like that." Furthermore, elsewhere on CandyRose.com is a transcript of an April 2000 CNN special called Burden of Proof, where John and Patsy Ramsey discuss their book, The Death of Innocence. And while discussing what the Ramseys suggest an investigator should do, CNN commentator Greta Van Susteren asks, "What would you tell them to do?" Patsy says, "I would say, this is the room where all of the evidence is stored. You start from the beginning, start combing and go." John says, "Go back to the neighborhood, talk to the neighbors. That's never been done by the police. Start from the beginning, start from scratch. Sit down with the parents, sit down with anybody that will talk to you within 100 yards radius of the house." Greta asks, "Didn't they talk to the neighbor, though, who heard a scream at some point?" Patsy says, "We don't know, Greta, because no one has ever... We hear rumors all the time. No one in authority has ever talked with us and told us what they know." John says, "What we know is what we have read or heard on television. We have not heard anything official from the police." "So was there a woman that heard a scream?" "I believe so because I've heard that reported." Greta asks, "But you don't know for certain?" John says, "I don't know for certain." So since the Ramseys were not even certain that neighbor Melody Stanton had actually heard a child scream, it would not appear that any Ramsey investigator would have contacted neighbor Joe Barnhill, nor told him he was mistaken about what he saw and to be quiet. So just who was this supposed mystery investigator who contacted Barnhill? Perhaps we'll never know. But that leads me to yet another unexplained reported eyewitness account, which is also documented on the website of CandyRose.com, and a supposed sighting of a man seen running from the crime scene in the early morning hours on December 26, 1996. Looking further into the story, it was initially reported on the Boulder News Forum on January 26 of 1997 by a man using the handle JD, but he says, "On KHOW radio in Denver about a week ago or so, a woman neighbor of Ramsey's called in and stated on the air that she had seen a running man, tall and slender, running away from the scene of the crime on December 26. She thought it was important, and so she reported her observation to the police. The police had not investigated her eyewitness story as of that time. The woman made her statement on the morning KHOW talk show hosted by Peter Boyle. If anyone has time and inclination, get tape of show, contact neighbor, ask police to follow up. Also, make sure that the Ramseys lawyers in Denver are aware of this claimed eyewitness story." And although I am not sure the Ramseys lawyers were aware of this, I know that Detective Lou Smith was, as he stated on the recent ABC 2020 special, The List.
"There was a person seen going across the lawn of the Ramsey house. The night of the murder. Was our killer trying to get into the house?
Or was he trying to leave the house? Because... Looking back to the JonBenet Reddit page, we find a post by Samar Candy where she specifies, "No, Barnhill saw his guy late afternoon on the 25th. Running Man was seen leaving the scene of the crime sometime after midnight on the 26th. At least that's the information I have. Which is correct, because Running Man was reported to have been seen on December 26th, as is documented on the acandyrose.com webpage regarding the Running Man sighting, which is clearly marked December 26th. But now, to conclude this episode, I would like to go back 2 days to December 24th, Christmas Eve, to what I believe is the greatest, most important eyewitness account, which I have not seen many people speaking of, at least not for quite a while, and that comes from the interrogation of John Ramsey by the late great detective Lou Smith. And while discussing Christmas Eve of 1996, John says, just to back up one step with Pasta J, the only thing I noticed that night that when there was this very striking couple there with their daughter who just stood out in my mind, and I noticed her in church, and he had very dark hair and she was very attractive, and I had never seen them in church, and they looked kind of like they were from East. They were well cared for, they were dressed up, and they were in Pasta J's. Lou asks also? John says also, and they kind of sat near us in the same room, and then they moved to a table in the other room, and I thought, Lou asks, is this the first time you thought of that? John says, no, I thought about it before. What was that? Who was it? I mean, it was kind of I saw these people in church and it's a coincidence that they ate in Pasta J's. And later I thought, who were those people? Lou asks, were they in a farther row or did anyone know them? Would that be an assigned register? John says, no, it's just a piece of data. Lou says, and you never seen them since? John says no, and then Lou moves on. So we are looking for a striking family of 3, possibly from the East Coast. He will have dark hair and she will have been, as John said, very attractive. They will have a daughter, whom I believe is likely much younger than JonBenet, as he did not mention any interactions with JonBenet and said daughter, either in the church or while they were sitting near them in Pasta J's. From my experience as a father of 3 myself, if there are any other kids of similar age within the vicinity of my kids, they tend to gravitate towards them. However, Detective Steve Thomas didn't put much stock in this eyewitness testimony, according to his book, JonBenet Inside the Ramsey Murder Investigation, in which he states, then he offered up a smorgasbord of suspects that included a cook at Pasta J's restaurant, a striking couple from back east who had been seen in church, his secretary's boyfriend, other church members, business associates, pigsty neighbors, and assorted fringe players. So, Detective Steve Thomas just bundled this highly questionable lead in with others as just part of the smorgasbord of assorted fringe player suspects. However, of all the eyewitness accounts we have discussed in this episode, I found this to be the most important, because I believe Mr. Ramsey is our greatest eyewitness to this horrible monster who committed this heinous crime. We will discuss that much more in future episodes. But for now, I will conclude this episode of JonBenét's WebbTruths. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for updates. And make sure to tune in for our next episode, titled Just Business, where we take a closer look at just exactly what John Ramsey's business, Access Graphics, did that got him over $1 billion in sales that year. And unfortunately may have been part of the reason this horrible crime occurred. So we'll see you on the next episode as we get one step closer to identifying the horrible monster responsible for this heinous crime.
You're still here? It's over. Go home. Go.
Yeah, go home. Because I have homework for you, and it relates to another important eyewitness account, which will come into play in our upcoming narrative as to why the Ramsey family was targeted and who was involved. But that is not my story to tell. It is the hosts of the Case by Case podcast story, as only they can, because Case by Case is the only true crime podcast that brings you insights into the world of high-profile cold cases from the perspective of the police, the press, and the prosecution. Hosted by Sergeant Michelle Wood, homicide prosecutor Jarrett Ferrantino, and investigative journalist Steph Watts, Case by Case gives you insight into how these 3 pillars of law enforcement work together to solve these cases. And this time they are working on solving JonBenet in 3 amazing episodes, which can be found on Apple Podcasts. And I will put a link in the description. And there is also extra credit if you like what you're hearing, and
You can find a friend.
and tell them about this series. We need to blow the roof off the YouTube algorithm and get as many eyes on this series as we possibly can. Not because of any monetization, as I have not and will not be monetizing this channel, but because the truth needs to finally come out.